Here we go. Welcome, listeners. Here we are again, the We Love Our Heart podcast to help you understand your heart health a little bit better. And today it is my great pleasure to welcome a very smart gentleman and someone we've been working with for the past 6 weeks or so, none other than Graham Phillips from Pro Longevity. Without further ado, Graham, say hello.
Mark, how are you?
Yeah, actually top of the world. No small thanks to you, by the way.
One does one's humble best.
So, guys, what we've been doing. So, what Graham? No, Graham. Should I introduce what you do, or do you want to introduce what you do? That's the interest.
Well, I tell you what. You give them your version of it, and if I feel I need to fill in the gaps, but in many ways, I think your perception of what I do is going to be more helpful to your listeners than my broadcast about it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So basically, we stumbled across Graham through our good friend Ivor Cummins, who'd also talked to Graham. And as most of you know or should know by now, I've been trying to dive deeper into the issues behind heart disease, and in particular, I'll be perfectly honest, my own heart disease. And Graham has been talking about, and Ivor too, about the massive spread of type 2 diabetes, and that basically type 2 diabetes is linked towards insulin resistance, metabolic illness, and many of these pretty scary silent ticking time bombs that some of us / many of us have in our chest, which lead ultimately to one of those nasty big events that happened to me in 2018 potentially, i.e. a heart attack, but a sudden heart attack, in fact. But maybe if I'd have spotted some of the warning signs earlier, I could have done something to avoid it. So now I'm trying to reset my body, if you like, as much as I can. There are only so many things I can control or manage. My cardiologist can only control and manage some of the other things. But one of the things I can control is my consumption of sugars and processed foods and things like this, and hopefully manage my insulin, basically. And that's where Graham has come into the scheme with his coaching from Pro Longevity to look closely at my data. It's data driven as much as anything else, and to sort of highlight what I could be doing better and things I'm doing wrong. How about that, Graham?
I think that's right, because in medical systems, we look at people's sugar. And if you go to your GP, and that probably applies in most countries that your listeners will come from, what your GP, your family doctor, will do is they will test something called HbA1c.
Yeah.
And HbA1c is the measure of your long-term blood glucose control, and it's a look at what's happened over 3 months. And the reason we pick a 3 month period is it relates to the life of a red blood corpuscle. So generally speaking, your red blood cells last 12 weeks.
Right.
And during that period, if there's a lot of blood glucose in your bloodstream, then you get what you call glycated hemoglobin. In other words, you've got molecules of blood glucose stuck to your heme, to your red blood cells. And that's why it's HbA1c, glycated hemoglobin.
Right.
Now, the trouble is this, that I always talk about diabetes, metabolic syndrome, as a 20, sometimes 30-year journey. And most of us have a lifestyle that raises our blood glucose, forcing our insulin up. And for most of that journey, you will have supreme blood glucose control and a fabulous HbA1c. So you'll go to your GP, they'll check your HbA1c, but not your insulin. And yeah, you may have slightly deranged liver enzymes, slightly unfavorable lipid profile, a little bit of hypertension. The trouble is 2 or 3 things. The first one is that it's not until your blood glucose completely overwhelms your insulin that you get diabetes. So you're kind of 20, maybe 30 years down track.
Yeah.
The second problem is that all the norms change. So basically, the laboratory tests are 2 standard deviations away from the mean.
Yeah.
Which probably means nothing to you. But
it means a lot to me. I've studied maths extensively.
Right. Okay. So to explain that in lay terms, what it means is, as society gets sicker, the labs change and the average gets less healthy. So what we do is instead of saying society is getting less healthy, we say no, we'll just change the average to match the new population.
I'm sorry. So
which is fine.
in layman's term, moving the goalposts effectively.
It's exactly moving the goalpost. So that's number two problem. Number three problem is that what most doctors will look at is they'll look at what's in red writing. And what's in red writing is the areas of the test where you're outside the normal.
Mm-hmm.
They will ignore it. So as long as it's between A and B, let's suppose your HbA1c should be no higher than, let's say, 6.
Okay, I was gonna say, Graham, put some figures on the table. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the case of cholesterol, they'll look at 5 point something. In the case of HbA1c, they'll look at 6, or they'll look at sort of 40, depending on which units, whether you're thinking is sort of centigrade or Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
Don't worry too much about that.
Yeah.
What they won't, so in other words, if you're just within parameters, and remember parameters are changing, they'll say, you're fine, Mr. Falstad, come back in a year and a year and a year.
Yeah.
What no one does is track forensically how these individual different tests are tracking over time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me put this in terms of a business, right? If everyone who runs a business knows that the balance sheet is a snapshot on that day.
Yeah.
So if you've got, let's suppose, £100,000 in your balance sheet, you don't know if a year ago there was £0 in your balance sheet, now you've got £100,000. That's great.
Yeah.
But if a year ago your balance sheet had £1 million and now it's only got £100,000, the trend is entirely negative.
Yeah.
So we've got a balance sheet of our lives, a balance sheet of our health, and trend that no one looks at until something goes wrong. So that's number two problem.
Yeah.
Or is that number three? I think that's number three problem.
Yeah. Three, yeah.
So it's the fact that as society gets sicker, the norms change. Then doctors are not looking forensically. None of us are trained forensically to look at the changes over time until something goes into the red. Number three problem is that no health professionals are trained in nutrition, exercise, or sleep. All our training is wait for the illness, diagnose the illness, and then suppress it with drugs. So the whole prevention agenda is entirely absent from pharmacy, nursing, and medicine. Now, put all those things together with a terrible diet in Western society, and you've got, I don't even think we can call it a perfect storm. Or to put it another way, the number of deaths from all these diseases added up together makes COVID look like a walk in the dark.
Yeah.
Like a walk in the park.
Walk in the park, yeah.
Right? So, for example, in the UK, and I don't want to get into the whole COVID debate, that's another debate for another day, but to give you figures on this, in a normal year in the UK, about 540,000 people die in a normal year.
Right.
Excess COVID deaths last year are at most 50,000.
Yeah.
Excess.
Yeah.
So and we think of the efforts that the world has put in to trying to address COVID.
Yeah.
While ignoring 95% of the rest of the illness.
Well, I'm on the same page as you there, Graham. But the thing that I wanted to pick up, what was really interesting, is this whole without deriding the medical profession in any way. And I always, we always say, listen, get your doctor's advice, listen to your doctor. My personal opinion is, or what I personally do is look beyond what I'm told. But and I just mentioned to this as we kind of warmed up. We, as my generation, possibly the generation before us, and possibly the generation after us, have been taught. So, what can I say? It's built into our DNA that we listen to our doctor. A friend of mine even said that, you listen to Muhammad or God, whoever, and number two is your doctor, the family doctor. He or she knows best, and you do not ask any questions. When the doctor says take this, then that is what you do. And, going back to this whole thing, prevention, nutrition, is maybe not on the syllabus because they just, well, to be fair, they probably don't have enough time for it, right? Let's be honest. And you and I also know that when you're training to be a doctor as well, nutrition is a tiny part of the syllabus. Fair enough.
A tiny or almost entirely absent part.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Even now, the newly qualified doctors coming out today, at most, might have 24 hours of coaching on nutrition in their it takes 10 years to become a family doctor. And in the entire 10 years, you may have 24 hours of teaching on nutrition.
Yeah.
And it's not changing.
No,
So
but let me just
none of us
say, I
have
mean,
that
you've
information.
probably heard of a guy called Hippocrates, right? I mean, he's the one who is responsible for the Hippocratic oath that all doctors have to take that says you shall do it, you shall not harm your patients. He is the one who's also quoted saying, my medicine is what I eat, and what I eat is my medicine. Period.
And Hippocrates is completely right, and we've all forgotten it. So I
Absolutely.
totally agree, Mark.
Yeah.
So if I just sort of explain a little bit more about the Prolongevity service. So
Please.
we've kind of given some background, some context. And I practiced. I'm quite angry in a sense because I feel I've been duped because all the science that I learned at university and my medical colleagues learn, we are never taught these kind of fundamentals of why is this all these diseases are new. So 120 years ago, there's plenty of evidence. Diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, and cancer essentially didn't exist.
Yeah.
They're brand new diseases,
Yeah.
and they've come on in a generation or two or three or four, and that cannot possibly be genetic.
Can I just
it's
add
not
there,
genetic,
because I did a bit of
that's-
research on that, and I think the very first clinically diagnosed heart attack was, wait for it, 1908.
Yes, that's about right.
Yeah.
And a lot of us just believe that the reason it wasn't diagnosed previously was either they didn't have the ability to diagnose, which is wrong,
Yeah.
or people died too young and just didn't, they died
getting
young
into
with
that risk
something
age or
else.
whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Neither of those things is true. It simply didn't exist. And this whole thing with Ansel Keys and the diet heart hypothesis is all threaded through this because he chucked a load of money at what was then the American Heart Association and invented this whole system of seed oils and vegetable oils. And then the statin industry got on the back of it. And the whole thing has been hijacked by vested interest of industry, big food on the other and big pharma, big food on the one hand and pharma on the other.
Yeah.
And all health professionals are getting the wrong education. And that makes me very angry because like most health professionals, I got as a freshly minted pharmacist, I set out to do my absolute best for my patients, spent 30 years practicing what I believe was evidence-based medicine, and now realise I was never presented with the majority of the evidence. And it's completely transformed my practice.
Yeah. And okay, let's push all that behind us now. Let's talk about very much because it was a bit scary what we've said up until now, but I know a lot of this can be changed. A lot of it can be changed
Sure.
quickly, and I know what you do with Prolongevity is very much geared towards the positive changes than the negative.
So we apply these fundamentals of understanding of science, and we provide all our clients with a continual blood glucose monitor, among other things. So we'll take the standard test that I talked about, but rather than just looking at what's in red, we'll look at trend over 3 or 4 years. We'll also look very forensically at the test. So it's very data driven. Mm-hmm. We will check things like early signs of not very good blood pressure, not ideal lipid profile, deranged liver function. So we can often see things going wrong well before they go wrong.
Yeah.
And then that in combination with an understanding of people's lifestyles, where they are in their health journey, and the use of a blood glucose monitor means that we can apply preventive measures before people go through the terrible tragedy that you suffered.
Well, I'm still here. It was a pretty shocking event, but I'm still here.
It was. I think your podcast with Ivor was the one after mine, and I've for many years said to people, you can't outrun a bad diet. But I have to say, I was quite shaken by listening to your podcast.
Yeah, I was quite. Those events were pretty funny. But look, Graham, we don't have to look very far. You saw what happened the other day at the European finals or the European football when poor old Christian Eriksen collapsed on pitch with a sudden cardiac arrest.
And I'm not a great follower of sport, but certain sports from time to time interest me. And I remember following the World Cup football at the last round, and footballers are universally, very good looking, very fit, very athletic guys with absolute sheath of muscle across their gut, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I could tell the ones who had metabolic syndrome from the rest quite
Okay.
simply.
Yeah.
The ones who were eating well and not lots of carbs and carb loading had perfectly flat stomachs. The ones who carb load, you could see that they had bulging bellies. So although there was this fantastic sheath of muscle, it was like someone pushing outward on a balloon.
Ooh.
And if you look at football and if you look at sport, those who are, I mean, they're incredibly fit,
Yeah.
but they're not necessarily incredibly healthy. And you can see that they've got slightly bulging stomachs. There's just a very slight curve where the stomach is instead of absolutely flat.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's visceral fat. And I guarantee you a lot of those guys, as I was discovered with the study they did in all those Irish football players,
Yeah. Extra
there
time
are
moving.
half
Yeah.
of them will end up with metabolic syndrome because once they're no longer running and using all their energy up, they'll put the weight on and everything will start to go wrong.
Yeah. No, exactly. And okay, let's get back again to pro longevity because I've been with the program now. I don't know what 6, 7, 8 weeks, and
Yeah.
it almost became almost an obsession with me to be checking my blood sugar values and to looking at the graphs. And it's really interesting. Even though I think I'm managing my diet quite well, with various recommendations. I still sort of tested myself a little bit to see what would happen if I did this and what happens if I did that. And it became quite an obsession to see the little peaks and then flatten out. And listeners, the most interesting thing I learned with Graham was within the first week or something, a Sunday evening where I'd had a couple of glasses of wine, and then I have to be honest, I took a whiskey, a nightcap, small glass of whiskey to bed with me, and then in the middle of the night, this damn alarm on my phone kept going off, and of course I'd never heard this kind of peep before, and I was like looking around without my glasses, like what's going on? What have we left on? Is that the oven, the fire, whatever? And it turns out that it was my glucose alarm because I'd gone hypoglycemic, right, Graham? And then you explained to me afterwards. Well, you can explain now.
Sure. So if you have a lot of sugar in your diet, then the sugar in the diet overwhelms the natural processes. But the body is full of mechanisms to balance things. And you have two competing hormones, insulin and glucagon. And everything insulin does, glucagon does the reverse. Now, so insulin lowers your blood glucose and glucagon raises your blood glucose. Now, if you never have any carbs or sugar in your diet for the rest of your life, your blood glucose will not be zero. And the reason is that when you burn your stored fat as energy, you've probably heard of triglyceride.
I have, yeah.
Right.
We have, yeah.
If you imagine a triglyceride as a letter E,
okay.
And the three horizontal prongs are fats, which you burn, and the backbone of the E is glycerol.
Mm-hmm.
And the glycerol goes back to the liver when you burn your fat, and it's remanufactured back to glucose. And that's a process called gluconeogenesis. So it's making glucose from the fat. And that is the body's natural mechanism to maintain the necessary level of blood glucose. And it explains two things. That, yes, glucose is always necessary to have in your bloodstream, but you don't need to take any through your mouth because the body will always make the amount that it needs.
Right.
Now, that process of gluconeogenesis, which takes place in the liver, is poisoned by alcohol. So what you were doing is you weren't taking...
Sorry, listeners, just listen to that word there, because that's what really shocked me. It's not like stopped or slowed down or paused. The word he used there was poisoned.
It's not permanently poisoned.
No,
so
I know, Graham, but it's still a bit. It's the difference between. It's the difference between going through an amber light just as it's turning from green to going through a red light that's been there 3 seconds. It's just a whole different mental image.
So if we go back to these two hormones, the insulin and the glucagon, right?
Yeah.
And your insulin levels are high, pushing down on glucose. Your glucagon normally balances it and pushes upwards to give you the right balance.
Yeah.
and all of that is maintained through the liver. But if you poison the liver pathway, which is what you were doing with the alcohol, all of a sudden you've got insulin on its own, glucagon in effect not working, and you have a hypo because your liver is no longer able to maintain the appropriate blood glucose levels. And that was what explaining your nighttime hypos.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize that enough, that this visual, actually audible as well, this visual warning or sign of what alcohol was doing to me has really put me off. I mean, I've spent a long time, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, I've spent a long time trying to reduce my alcohol intake because I know it's not good for me, even if I do enjoy the occasional glass of red wine. But actually seeing on the screen there that it was, this, and talking to Graham about poisoning and going hypo and everything, that really has really encouraged me to really reduce, and that's working, actually.
I mean, to be clear, I'm not anti-alcohol. I'm not averse to having a drink, and I'm not some kind of killjoy who lives a perfect life, always wearing a hair shirt. But you need to be aware of these things and understand how they're affecting you. And knowledge is power, because people have spent many, many years of their lives eating the wrong food and going through these different processes with no understanding of it until they get a big problem like you did.
Yeah. And to quote Ivor, and I keep thinking about this often. He says there's no such thing as a sudden heart attack. You've just been looking in the wrong place, or you haven't seen the signs. And you've also talked about this, this metabolic illness as maybe a 20 to 30 year journey, which sounds a bit scary in a way. But Graham, as we move towards the end of this, the outlook is positive if you start to take action, right?
Absolutely.
It's nothing that is, irreversible. Sorry.
Irreversible, absolutely. So if we go back to where we came in, which is that I said that these diseases are brand new man-made diseases that didn't exist 120 years ago and don't exist in nature.
Yeah.
And if you get a good handle on what about your lifestyle is causing them, it kind of adds up like this, that your genes are not your destiny. Yeah. So even if you have a genetic predisposition to one of these illnesses, that doesn't mean that you'll get them. And so long as you know what lifestyle related measures to take, you can have a very, very long and very healthy life and be very optimistic. And I think the fact that actually our genes play only a small role in the expression of our healthy longevity is incredibly empowering and very positive, because it means that 90% of it's under your own control. And if someone gives you the right measures and the right advice, there you go, off you go.
Absolutely. And despite everything that's happened to me, I've also always been the opinion, if you blame it on your genes, you've lost the battle already, because it's basically you lying down on your back and saying, okay, game over. And I'm not prepared to do that.
And you're right. You're absolutely right, Mark.
Yeah. And one thing before we wrap up, I just wanted to mention that the other potential consequences of type 2 diabetes, right? I mean, I've heard this mentioned before, that because one of my things is at the moment is that a heart attack is a pretty scary event. It's scary for me as a person, although I was unconscious. It's even more terrifying for my family, but we won't go into that now because I'll get all emotional.
Sure.
But what for many people is potentially more scary is the idea of dementia, is the idea of Alzheimer's, is the idea of being alive and having their physical faculties, but not being able to recognize their own daughter. Or the daughter not being able to talk to her father because he doesn't recognize her.
Well, at the weekend, Karen and I went to see The Father.
Right.
And that's a movie exactly about.
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant to see The Father as in a person. No, I didn't. Oh, God, sorry.
No. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie about dementia. And if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it to anyone. It really will make you think. So the point is that there's a kind of direct line between metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes and dementia. And I often quote this as a fabulous study recently that when the brain becomes insulin resistant, because there's been too much insulin going around for too long because of the diet, which has raised the insulin in the first place, the brain then can't absorb the glucose that it needs and it starves. And they did this wonderful study and they radio labeled the blood glucose, and they could see that the blood glucose couldn't enter the brain. And you can see this in early when people's cognition starts to deteriorate, well before you fully diagnose them with dementia, you can see that the insulin resistant brain means that you can't absorb the energy in the form of glucose from the bloodstream.
Right.
They then switched this group of people from a glucose-based diet, a sugar-based diet, to keto.
Mm-hmm.
And they then radio labeled the fat in the bloodstream. And guess what? The brain was happily gobbling up the fat as energy. So even when you've gone as far as that along the path of a negative journey, it's not too late. And a switch from a carby-based sugary diet to a keto diet may well mean that you can avoid dementia or reverse it.
Yeah.
So all of my messages are positive. You just need to know what to do and what metrics to measure, what measures you should put in place, and then what action to take.
Yeah. And whether you do, I mean, what we're discovering, Graham, you and me personally, is that maybe I'm not as metabolically ill as I thought I was, but, you know, the scores aren't in yet. The final scores aren't in yet, folks. But even so, generally speaking, it's much healthier to follow a low-carb diet and avoid these processed foods and seed oils and all the rest of it. Whether or not it's triggering some horrible insulin reactions in me, I mean, you know, back to my story right from the beginning, and you know, I stand 100% next to Ivor with this. He always, you know, there was me, you know, cycling like mad, eating lots of, you know, carb loading, like you said, for events or even for training. And, you know, the sugar in my blood was basically ripping the inside of my arteries out, which was then being repaired by cholesterol and all those other mechanisms, which was then causing a heart attack. And whether that is, you know, ultimately insulin resistance or not, it certainly wasn't, you know, good for me long term, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And all foreseeable and preventable if someone had given you the right information.
And that's what it's all about at We Love Our Heart, and that's why we're talking today together, Graham. And thank you very much for your help with what we're going through at the moment with Pro Longevity and your coaching. And listeners, we're going to put the links below where you can find Graham yourself and take advantage of the data-driven and problem-solving approach to diabetes.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, Graham, that's a super point upon which to end, and I thank you very much. It's been most interesting. Thank you so much.
It's an absolute pleasure, Mark. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Graham, cheerio.
Cheers.